My name is Emma. The moment those notes scattered like fallen leaves on the cold concrete, the air in my lungs turned to ice. I watched her walk away, completely oblivious that the oxygen for her dying grandfather was spilling into the wind. I had no home, no bread, and a heart hardened by my own hunger. Yet in those few seconds of frantic urgency, I held a stranger's heartbeat in my trembling hands. Every second I hesitated was a second stolen from a man named Arnold, who was running out of time. This is the story of why I chose to lose my world, just to save hers. I thank you from the depths of my soul for bearing witness to this journey and for walking beside me through the shadows. In the quiet theater of Mother Story, we believe that no act of grace is ever too small to change the trajectory of a life. If these words have resonated with your spirit or brought a flicker of light to your day, I would be deeply honored if you would subscribe and join our family. Let us keep the flame of humanity burning together, one heart at a time. Your presence is the greatest wealth I could ever hope to possess. I walk through the world as a shadow, my pockets filled with nothing but the cold wind of my own struggles. Life has taught me that survival is a lonely road, and my heart has grown calloused under the weight of my own unspoken needs. The city of Pekalongan, usually vibrant with the colors of batik and the scent of the sea, appeared to me only in shades of bruised purple and slate gray. To the bustling crowds, I was a ghost, a flickering glitch in their peripheral vision, a woman whose name had long been erased from the ledgers of the fortunate. My name is Emma, though no one has spoken it with tenderness in years. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of my own breath, a shallow, rattling thing that feels too heavy for my lungs. My apartment is a skeletal remains of a life once lived, a place where the wallpaper peels like sunburnt skin, and the silence is so thick it feels like drowning. I often look at the empty chair by the window, the one where Neville used to sit. He would watch the sun rise and tell me that the world was a masterpiece in progress. But Neville is gone now, taken by a sickness that my empty purse couldn't cure. His absence is a hollow ache, a permanent winter in my soul that no sun can melt. Today, the air was particularly biting. I wrapped my thin, tattered coat tighter around my frame, feeling the jagged edges of my own ribs. My stomach was a knot of hunger, a familiar companion that whispered of all the things I couldn't have. I was headed nowhere in particular, just walking to keep the numbness from settling into my bones. The sidewalk was a river of strangers, all of them flowing toward destinations that mattered, driven by purposes I could no longer remember. I watched a young couple share a laugh, their joy a bright, offensive spark in my gray world. I watched a businessman, a man who looked like he could be Mr. Smith, shout into a silver phone about margins and profits, his voice a hammer against the fragile glass of the morning. They lived in a world of abundance, while I resided in the cracks between their footsteps. My calloused heart, as I called it, was my only armor. It was a fortress built of disappointment and reinforced by the cold reality that in this life, you are only as valuable as what you can afford. I had learned to look at the ground, to study the patterns of the cracks in the pavement, because looking up only reminded me of the height from which I had fallen. I had become an expert at invisibility. If I didn't exist to them, then their indifference couldn't hurt me. Or so I told myself. I passed a small bakery, the scent of warm bread a cruel torture. I felt the few coins in my pocket, pathetic, lonely things that wouldn't even buy a crust. I thought of the Mother Story and the reality of life, content I used to dream of creating, back when I believed my voice had a place in the digital symphony of the world. Now, my reality was a silent film, played on a loop of poverty and regret. As I turned a corner onto the main boulevard, the wind picked up, swirling dead leaves and discarded wrappers around my feet. The sky was a heavy lid of clouds, threatening a rain that would only add to the misery of the day. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of resentment, not at the people, but at the sheer, relentless weight of being. Why was I still walking? What was I searching for in this gray canvas of an existence? Then I saw her. A few paces ahead of me, a girl was walking with a hurried, rhythmic stride. She wore a crimson backpack that stood out like a drop of blood on a white sheet. She seemed focused, her head down, her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying the weight of the entire city. I didn't know then that her name was Anna. I didn't know that our fates were about to collide in a way that would shatter my fortress and force me to feel the raw, stinging pulse of humanity once again. I stayed in my lane, a shadow following a spark. I watched the way her heels clicked against the stone, a frantic metronome. She was a Pelajar, a student, perhaps, or a young worker struggling to make ends meet. There was a vulnerability in the way her backpack swayed, the zipper slightly agape, revealing a glimpse of something red and white inside. At that moment, I was still the woman with the calloused heart. I was still the woman who believed that the world owed me nothing, and that I owed the world even less. I didn't know that within the next few minutes, the gray canvas of my days would be stained with a color I hadn't seen in years, the color of hope, messy and terrifying. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my throat, and kept walking, one foot in front of the other. A shadow in the wind, a ghost in the machinery of a city that had forgotten how to see. The sidewalk was a blur until a flash of crimson caught my eye, a student's backpack, unzipped and careless. It was a vibrant, mocking red against the dull, rain-threatened gray of the morning. I was walking a few paces behind, my head bowed against the wind, when the world seemed to tilt. The girl ahead of me, Anna, though she was just a nameless silhouette then, was walking with a frantic, desperate energy, her ponytail swinging like a pendulum marking the seconds of a life in crisis. She didn't notice the teeth of the zipper on her bag had parted, a metal mouth yawning wide to release its secrets. Then, like falling autumn leaves, the banknotes drifted to the pavement. They didn't fall with a thud. They fluttered. They danced on the breeze for a fraction of a second, pink and red slips of paper that looked like flower petals scattered at a funeral. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, cold intake of air that burned like dry ice. I stopped dead in my tracks, my worn-out shoes rooting me to the concrete. I watched Anna walk away, her figure growing smaller with every passing second, completely oblivious that her world was spilling onto the cold, indifferent concrete. She was losing her anchor, and she didn't even feel the weight lift. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only heartbeats. Around me, the city continued its mechanical roar. People stepped over the money without seeing it, their eyes fixed on their phones or the distant horizon. Only I, the ghost of Pekka Longon, witnessed the miracle and the tragedy unfolding on the ground. My heart, that calloused, stone-like thing, began to hammer against my ribs with a violence that made me dizzy. I knelt, my joints creaking like an old house. My fingers, trembling and blue-tipped from the cold, reached out. The first note was crisp, it felt like electricity against my skin. As I gathered them one by one, the stack grew thick. I had never held this much money in my life. Not even when Neville was healthy, and we were dreaming of a small house with a garden of jasmine. I clutched the bundle to my chest, pulling it into the sanctuary of my tattered coat. The warmth of the paper was a cruel irony. This money could buy 1,000 meals. It could pay the back rent that kept me awake at night, listening for the landlord's heavy footsteps. It could buy the medicine I had skipped for months. It was a rain of promises, each bill a tiny, rectangular God capable of answering my prayers. She's gone, the dark voice in my head whispered. She didn't see. She's young. She'll recover. But you're dying in the shadows, Emma. This is the universe paying you back for everything it took. I looked down at the money in my hands. It was so much. I felt a surge of intoxicating joy, a brief, shimmering delusion that my struggles were over. I could walk away. I could turn into a side alley, disappear into the maze of the market, and never look back. I could be a person again, not just a shadow. But then I looked up. Anna was almost at the corner now. There was something in the slope of her shoulders, a profound, crushing weariness that mirrored my own. She wasn't just a student. She was a girl carrying a mountain. I remembered the day I lost Neville. I remembered the feeling of the world slipping through my fingers, the desperation of trying to hold onto water with open palms. The mother story I used to tell myself, the one about a woman who remained noble despite the dirt on her hands, began to itch at the back of my mind. If I took this, I wouldn't just be taking money. I would be taking someone else's hope to fuel my own survival. I would be becoming the very thing I hated, a thief of light. My calloused heart didn't feel so hard anymore. It felt like it was cracking open, the raw, stinging pulse of empathy flooding through the fissures. The gray canvas of the sidewalk seemed to scream at me. The money felt heavy now, like lead, or like the stones they place on the eyes of the dead. I thought of Sarah, the grandmother I didn't know yet, and Arnold, the grandfather fighting for breath in a sterile hospital bed. I didn't know their names, but I knew their pain. It was the same pain that lived in my empty apartment. It was the same pain that had taken Neville. I stood up, the money tucked tightly in my hand. My legs felt weak, like those of a newborn calf. I had a choice. The crossroads was right here, under my feet, marked by the gum-stained concrete and the rushing wind. I could be the woman who survived by scavenging the ruins of others, or I could be something else. Wait! The word died in my throat, a silent plea. I began to walk. Not away from her, but toward her. Each step was a battle against the hunger in my stomach and the fear in my soul. I was following the crimson trail she had left behind, a trail of accidental sacrifice. I was a shadow chasing a spark, not to extinguish it, but to return the fire. The reign of paper promises was over. Now, there was only the cold reality of the chase. I watched her turn the corner, her red backpack a beacon in the gloom. I didn't know that listening to her voice would change everything. I only knew that for the first time in years, I wasn't just walking to stay alive. I was walking because someone else's life depended on it. I tightened my grip on the banknotes, the edges cutting into my palm. I wouldn't let her world shatter on the concrete. Not if I could help it. I clutched the bundle of bills to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that felt like a frantic plea for mercy. In my hands was a fortune I had never dared to dream of. The paper was thick, slightly textured, and carried the faint, metallic scent of wealth, a scent that was entirely foreign to my world of dust and dampness. For a fleeting, shameful moment, I saw a way out of my own darkness, a chance to silence the ghosts of my own poverty. The serpent began to whisper then. It wasn't a loud, booming voice, but a soft, seductive hiss that slithered through the cracks of my broken spirit. "Look at it, Emma," it murmured. "This is your salvation. This is the universe finally balancing the scales for every night you went to bed crying, for every meal you skipped, for every dream that died in the cold." I looked down at the money again, my eyes blurred by a sudden, hot rush of tears. I had never seen so much money in one place. It felt heavy not with weight, but with possibility. With this, I could pay Mr. Smith the 6 months of back rent I owed him. I could see the look of surprise on his face as I handed him the cash, reclaiming a small piece of my dignity. I could buy a coat that actually kept out the wind. I could buy a headstone for Neville, something more than the unmarked patch of grass that currently held the only man I ever loved. The joy of the discovery was intoxicating. It was a visceral, electric thrill that made my fingertips tingle. For one heartbeat, I was in the shadow, walking the streets of Pekalongan. I was a woman with a future. I could restart the reality of life, channel I had abandoned. I could tell the mother story that had been trapped in my throat for years. I could be someone again. "She won't even miss it," the serpent hissed, its voice growing bolder. "She's young. She has her health. She probably has parents who will just give her more. But you? You have nothing. You are a ghost, and ghosts need to eat, too." I leaned against the rough brick of a building, my legs trembling. The temptation was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs. I thought of my apartment, the peeling wallpaper that looked like skeletal hands, the silence that tasted like copper, the cold that felt like a permanent resident. I thought of the betrayal, of life itself, how it had stripped me of everything until I was just a shell. Why shouldn't I betray my conscience to survive? But as I watched the crimson backpack of the girl, Anna, disappearing into the crowd, a different memory surfaced. It was a memory of Neville, his eyes bright even as the light was fading from them. He used to say that the only thing poverty couldn't steal was our integrity. He used to say that if we lost our soul, we had nothing left to save. The realization hit me like a splash of icy water. I could not take what was not mine. This money was Buchanhacknia. It did not belong to me. The serpent's whisper turned into a scream of protest. Don't be a fool. This is your only chance. I closed my eyes tight, fighting the urge to turn and run in the opposite direction. I thought about the reality of life. If I took this money, the reality of my life would be built on a foundation of theft. I would be silenced not by poverty, but by my own guilt. I would never be able to look at my reflection in a window without seeing a thief staring back. I opened my eyes. The girl was still visible, a small dot of red in the distance. My heart was still hammering, but the tempo had changed. It was no longer a plea for mercy. It was a call to action. I realized that returning this money was the only way to truly silence the ghosts. Because if I kept it, the ghosts of my poverty would only be replaced by the ghost of the woman I used to be. I pushed off from the wall, my resolve hardening like cooling iron. The joy I had felt at finding the money was gone, replaced by a heavy, solemn purpose. I had to return it. I had to find her before the city swallowed her whole. I began to move, my feet finding a strength they hadn't possessed moments ago. I wasn't just walking anymore. I was chasing the light. I was turning my back on the serpent and walking into the fire of my own conscience. Wait, I thought, my voice a silent prayer directed at the girls retreating back. Please don't go too far. Let me give your world back to you. I didn't know then that the money was for Arnold's surgery. I didn't know that Sarah was waiting for a miracle. I only knew that I was a woman who had been a shadow for too long, and for the first time in years, I wanted to do something that mattered. I wanted to be more than a victim of my circumstances. I clutched the bundle tighter, but this time, I wasn't holding on to a fortune. I was holding on to a chance for redemption. I started to run, my tattered coat flapping behind me like broken wings, following the girl with the red backpack into the heart of the city. Conscience is a quiet, persistent ache. I looked at the money, then at the retreating figure of the girl. I began to follow her, my feet heavy with the battle between greed and grace. I needed to find the girl named Anna and return the burden I had claimed, the wealth that felt like lead in my pocket. The sidewalk stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of gray, a path paved with the choices of 1,000 lost souls. Every step I took toward Anna felt like a betrayal of my own survival, yet every step I took away from the temptation felt like the first breath of air after nearly drowning. I was a ghost chasing a living flame, navigating through a sea of strangers who were as blind to my internal war as they were to the money that had just rained upon the earth. The bundle of cash was tucked inside my tattered red purse, pressed against my hip. It felt warm, almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own, a stolen life force that didn't belong to me. My mind was a chaotic storm. I thought of the empty cupboards in my kitchen, the cold tea bags I had reused until they were nothing but stained paper, and the looming threat of Mr. Smith and his final eviction notice. For a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to have a full stomach, this money wasn't just paper. It was a miracle. It's just one note, the darkness in my mind whispered. She has so many. She wouldn't even notice if one was gone. You could buy coal for the winter. You could buy a flower for Neville's grave. But then I saw the way Anna walked. She wasn't strolling. She was practically running, her shoulders tight, her head down. She looked like someone carrying the weight of a world that was about to collapse. I realized that my poverty had made me selfish, but it hadn't yet made me cruel. I couldn't build my comfort on the ruins of her desperation. The wind whipped through the narrow alleys of Pekalongan, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. I struggled to keep pace, my old, worn-out shoes clicking frantically against the stones. My lungs burned with the effort, the cold air scraping against my throat. Anna turned a corner, her crimson backpack a flickering beacon in the gloom. I was terrified of losing her, of being left alone with this stolen fortune and the guilt that would surely consume me. I thought of the reality of life I had witnessed so many times, the way the world discards those who can no longer keep up. I had been discarded once, when Neville passed, and the bills began to pile up like a mountain of snow. I knew the taste of salt from crying into an empty pillow. If I didn't return this money, I would be the one discarding Anna. I would be the one pushing her into the shadows where I lived. As I followed her, memories of Neville surfaced, unbidden and sharp. He used to say that the most beautiful batik patterns weren't the ones with the most gold, but the ones with the most soul. Emma, he would whisper, his voice as soft as the silk he worked with, never let the world turn your heart into stone. Even when the thread breaks, keep the pattern true. I felt the calluses on my heart begin to soften, the layers of bitterness peeling away like old paint. The greed was a sharp, biting cold, but the grace was a low, steady heat. I chose the heat. I chose to be a human being again, even if it meant remaining a hungry one. Anna was nearing the hospital district now, a place where the air always felt heavy with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken prayers. The tall, sterile buildings of the medical center loomed over us, their windows reflecting the bruised sky. This was where the reality of life became most stark, where every breath had a price and every heartbeat was a negotiation with fate. I finally managed to close the distance, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was only a few feet behind her now. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling, ready to tap her on the shoulder and offer back the treasure I had found. I wanted to say her name, to tell her that I was sorry I had even thought of keeping it. But then she stopped. She pulled a phone from her pocket and pressed it to her ear. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile, broken thing that stopped me in my tracks. I stood in the shadow of her footsteps, my hand frozen in midair, as I heard the first notes of a tragedy I had only just begun to understand. The money in my purse suddenly felt heavier than ever, a burden of life and death that I had unknowingly claimed. I realized then that I wasn't just returning a bundle of paper, I was returning the oxygen for a soul I had never met. I stayed there, a silent observer in the corridor of her grief, waiting for the moment when I could finally give her back her world. I reached her just as she pressed a phone to her ear. I stood in the shadow of her footsteps, my hand outstretched to tap her shoulder, but her voice stopped me. It was a fragile, trembling sound, the sound of a soul reaching its breaking point. The bustling noise of the street seemed to fade into a dull hum, leaving only the sharp, jagged edges of her words to cut through the cold morning air. I was so close I could see the frayed edges of her crimson backpack and the way her fingers white-knuckled the phone. My own hand, still clutching the tattered red purse containing the fortune I had found, hovered in the space between us. I had intended to be the bearer of good news, the honest stranger returning what was lost, but as the first sob escaped her lips, I realized I was witnessing something far more intimate and devastating than a simple loss of currency. "I'm here, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking on the name. The name sounded like a prayer, and a plea all at once. I stood paralyzed, a ghost haunting the periphery of her grief. Through the speaker of her phone, I could hear a faint, raspy response, the voice of an older woman, likely her grandmother, Sarah, whose own strength seemed to be hanging by a thread. "I have the money," Anna continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point of misery only she could see. "I've collected every cent. I didn't eat for weeks, I took every extra shift. I have it all right here in my bag." My heart lurched. The money I had just watched tumble onto the pavement wasn't just pocket change or a student's allowance. It was the physical manifestation of her sacrifice. It was the skipped meals I had also known, the sleepless nights, and the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to outrun poverty. It was her sweat, her hunger, and her hope bundled into pink and red bills that I had almost considered keeping for myself. A wave of nausea washed over me, a physical reaction to the serpent's whisper that had earlier tempted me. How could I have even looked at that money with greed? Every bill was stained with the effort of a girl trying to save someone she loved. But Sarah? Anna's voice dropped to a hollow whisper, a sound that vibrated at the very frequency of heartbreak. "I just spoke to the nurse at the desk. The costs, they've gone up again. Even with everything I've saved, it's still not enough for Arnold's treatment. It's not enough to keep him with us. Hearing her grandfather's name, Arnold, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the wind. The reality of life was laid bare right there on the sidewalk. It was a cruel ledger where the numbers never quite added up to a human life. I saw the way her free hand moved to her face, trying to catch the tears that were now flowing freely. She looked so small against the backdrop of the towering hospital buildings, a lone soldier who had fought a war only to find the enemy's walls were higher than she could climb. "What am I going to do?" she choked out.
"He's all we have."
"If I can't pay for the surgery, he won't make it through the week." I felt the weight of my own past crashing down on me. I remembered the sterile smell of the ward where Neville had spent his final days. I remembered the way the doctors looked at me, not with malice, but with a clinical pity that hurt more than anger. I remembered the crushing silence of the apartment when I returned alone, the silence that had become my only companion. In Anna's voice, I heard my own unspoken screams from years ago. I heard the echo of every "if only" that had ever haunted my dreams. The frequency of her heartbreak was a tune I knew by heart, a melody of loss that I had played on a loop until the strings of my soul had frayed. I looked down at my red purse. Inside sat the money that Anna believed was still in her backpack, the money that, even if she found it, wouldn't be enough. And tucked into a hidden fold was my own meager life savings, the tiny bit of miracle I had been hoarding for my own desperate tomorrow. The battle between greed and grace was over. There was no more greed, only a profound, aching necessity. I realized that the universe hadn't dropped that money in my path for my salvation. It had dropped it so I could be the bridge for hers. Anna continued to weep quietly into the phone, her back to me, her world crumbling in the middle of a busy street. She didn't know that her lost money was less than an arm's length away. She didn't know that a shadow was standing behind her, finally seeing a way to step into the light. I took a shaky breath, my resolve solidifying into something unbreakable. I wouldn't just return her burden. I would lighten it. I would take the gray canvas of my existence and use whatever color I had left to tint her dark sky. The frequency of heartbreak is a terrible thing to hear, but it is also a call to arms. I lowered my hand from her shoulder. I didn't want her to see me. I didn't want her gratitude or her questions. I just wanted her to have her miracle. I watched her tuck the phone away, her movements slow and defeated, as she prepared to walk into that hospital to face the end of her world. I followed her a few steps more, closer than a stranger should be, waiting for the perfect moment to perform a silent act of grace. "I have it, Sarah," she whispered into the phone, her voice thick with tears. She was talking to her grandmother. "The money I saved, it's here, but the doctors say it's still not enough for Arnold's surgery." Hearing her grandfather's name felt like a physical blow to my chest. It wasn't just a name. It was a sudden, sharp reminder of the fragility of existence. In that moment, the reality of life shifted from a vague struggle for survival into a cold, clinical calculation. A life was being weighed against a stack of paper, and the scales were tipping toward the grave. I stood in the shadow of her footsteps, my hand frozen in the air. I had come to return what I found, but the conversation I was eavesdropping on changed the very nature of the act. This wasn't just about honesty anymore. It was about the price tag on breath. How many bills does it take to keep a heart beating? How many coins are required to buy one more day of laughter, one more shared meal, one more "I love you"? Anna's voice was a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. I watched her shoulders heave as she tried to stifle a sob, her fingers gripping the phone as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She was a girl at the end of her rope, looking down into an abyss that I knew all too well. I looked down at the tattered red purse I held. Inside was the money that had fallen from her bag, the fortune that had momentarily tempted my darker self. I also felt the weight of my own meager savings, the small envelope I had hidden away for my own someday. It was money I had scraped together through months of hunger and invisible labor. It was my safety net, my only shield against the total darkness of the streets. But as I listened to Anna tell Sarah about the deficit, the gap between what they had and what Arnold needed to stay alive. My own safety felt like a shameful luxury. "It's not enough," she had said. Those 3 words echoed through the canyons of the city buildings. I made my decision in the space between her heartbeats. I didn't think about my rent. I didn't think about the cold winter coming or the hunger that was already gnawing at my stomach. I thought about Neville. I thought about how I would have given my own soul to have heard a stranger's footsteps behind me on the day his breath became too expensive to afford. With trembling hands, I opened my purse. I pulled out the bundle of bills I had found on the pavement. Then I reached for my own envelope. I emptied it. Every wrinkled note, every coin that represented a meal I didn't eat, I added to her stack. I merged my life's work with hers, creating a new, thicker bundle of hope. I was no longer just returning a lost item. I was offering a sacrifice. I was putting a down payment on a stranger's miracle. Anna began to walk again, her steps heavy and defeated. She was heading toward the hospital, moving toward a confrontation with a Mr. Smith, or some other administrator who would look at her tears and see only a balance sheet. She had no idea that her backpack was about to become heavier than it had ever been. I followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to be fast. I needed to be invisible. I moved closer, the scent of her desperation mixing with the cold dampness of the morning air. She paused for a moment at the hospital's revolving doors, her head bowed in a silent prayer. This was it. With the grace of a ghost, I stepped forward. My hand reached out, light as a feather, and slipped the enhanced bundle back into the gaping mouth of her crimson backpack. I felt the fabric brush against my knuckles, a brief, electric contact with her world. I pushed the money deep, ensuring it wouldn't fall out again, and then I added the few remaining coins from my own pocket for good measure. I withdrew my hand as if the bag were made of white-hot iron. I turned away before she could sense my presence, melting back into the gray crowd of the sidewalk. I was now truly a shadow. My pockets were empty of everything but lint and the cold wind. I had no plan for tomorrow. I had no money for bread. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the memory of a name, Arnold. But as I walked away, the calloused heart that had been my armor felt like it was finally, painfully, beating again. I had seen the price tag on breath, and for once in my life, I had helped pay it. I didn't need to see her face when she found it. I didn't need to hear her cry of joy or her confused thanks to a god she thought had forgotten her. I just needed to know that somewhere in that cold, sterile building, a man named Arnold might get to take another breath because a woman named Emma chose to stop being a ghost. The gray canvas of my days was still there, but as I looked up at the sky, the clouds didn't seem quite so heavy. I had lost everything I owned, but I had found something I thought I had buried with Neville, the knowledge that even in the darkest reality of life, grace is a currency that never loses its value. As Anna wept into her phone, the memory of Neville flooded my mind like a broken dam, a cold and suffocating tide of what-ifs and if-onlys. I stood there, a few paces behind her, watching her world crumble while I held the pieces of it in my shaking hands. Neville had been my everything, my lost love whom I couldn't save because my pockets were empty, as hollow and mocking as a winter wind. I remembered the hospital room where Neville spent his final days, a room that smelled of stale bleach and the metallic tang of despair. I remembered the way the light from the monitor flickered across his pale face, tracing the hollows of his cheeks. He had looked at me with those tired, kind eyes, and I had seen the unspoken needs reflected in them, the need for a medicine we couldn't afford, the need for a procedure that carried a price tag higher than the sum of our lives. "Don't cry, Emma," he had whispered, his voice a ghost of the vibrant man who had once danced with me in the rain. But I did cry. I cried because I was a pelagar of poverty, a student of the cruelest school in the world, and I was failing my final exam. I had no money to buy him breath. I had no coins to pay for his heartbeat. I had watched him slip away, not because his spirit was weak, but because our reality of life was a ledger that only accepted gold for mercy. Now, standing behind Anna, I looked at the money in my hand. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was the oxygen for a dying man and the hope of a desperate girl. It was the miracle I had prayed for every night at Neville's bedside, the one that never arrived for me. The serpent's whisper was gone, drowned out by the roar of my own memories. I realized that if I walked away with this money, I wouldn't just be a thief, I would be an executioner. I would be signing Arnold's death warrant just as surely as poverty had signed Neville's. The money, that pink and red bundle of bills that had fallen so carelessly from her bag, was the only thing standing between a family and the same crushing silence that had lived in my apartment for years. I moved toward her with the stealth of a shadow. She was still talking to Sarah, her grandmother, her voice thick with the kind of tears that never truly dry. She was telling her that the money she saved wasn't enough, that the hospital's price for Arnold's life had gone up again. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a cold vice. The physical blow to my chest was the realization that I had the power to change the ending of her story, even if I couldn't change mine. I reached into my tattered red purse. I took my own life savings, the money I had hoarded like a squirrel against a winter I knew was coming, and I pressed it against the stack I had found. I didn't count it. I didn't think about the bread I wouldn't buy, or the rent I wouldn't pay to Mr. Smith. In that moment, the money wasn't mine or hers. It was a life force, a frantic pulse of energy that needed to be restored to its rightful place. With a hand that felt like it belonged to a different woman, I slipped the entire bundle back into the crimson backpack. I felt the rough fabric of the bag, the star-shaped logo on the back that seemed to wink at me in the gray light. I pushed it deep, past her notebooks and pens, until it was nestled at the bottom, a secret weight of grace. I turned and walked away before she could turn around. I didn't want her to see the ghost of Emma. I didn't want to explain why a stranger was crying more than she was. I wandered the streets of Pekalongan, my feet leading me toward the harbor where Neville and I used to watch the ships. The air was salty and sharp, biting into my skin, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the cold. I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. My pockets were truly empty now, filled with nothing but the wind, yet my soul felt heavy with a purpose I hadn't known since before the betrayal of Neville's death. As I walked, I imagined Anna entering the hospital. I imagined her sitting on one of those hard, plastic chairs, dreading the moment she had to tell the nurse she was short on funds. I imagined the moment she would reach into her bag, perhaps to find a tissue or her phone, and her fingers would brush against that thick, unexpected bundle. I could almost see it. The way her breath would hitch, the way her eyes would widen as she pulled out the stack of bills, not just the ones she had lost, but the extra ones I had added. I could hear the whisper of her voice calling Sarah back, telling her that a miracle had happened in the middle of a gray sidewalk. "Look, Neville," I whispered to the empty air, the sea spray stinging my eyes. "I couldn't save you. But maybe, just maybe, I saved someone else's Neville." The ghost of my husband didn't answer, but the wind seemed to soften for a moment, a gentle touch against my cheek. I was still a shadow in a city that didn't see me. I was still a woman with no tomorrow and an empty stomach. But as I watched the gray waves crash against the shore, I knew that I was no longer just a victim of the reality of life. I was its author, and for one brief, shining chapter, I had written a story of mercy. I sat on a weathered bench, my tattered coat wrapped around me, and waited for the night to fall. I had given away my survival, but I had found my humanity. And in the silence of the harbor, the ghost of Neville finally felt like a memory of love, rather than a memory of failure. I reached into my own tattered red purse, my fingers brushing against the frayed lining that felt as worn as my own spirit. I pulled out my own meager savings, the money I had set aside for my own desperate tomorrow. It wasn't much, just a handful of crumpled notes and a few heavy coins that represented months of skipping meals and working until my vision blurred. To anyone else, it was barely enough for a week's groceries, but to me, it was my jar of dreams, the only thing standing between me and the final, cold embrace of the streets. Compared to the stacks I found, it was small, but it was all I had. I stood in the shadow of the hospital's entrance, watching Anna's retreating back as she moved toward the heavy glass doors. In that moment of profound stillness, I merged my life's work with hers. I took those hard-earned bills, the ones I had intended to use to pay Mr. Smith and keep the roof over my head for one more month, and I tucked them into the bundle that had fallen from her bag. The weight of the purse in my hand vanished, replaced by a terrifying, hollow lightness. I had officially emptied my future into the backpack of a stranger. As I walked away, the immediate consequences began to claw at me. The wind seemed to recognize my vulnerability, biting through my thin coat with renewed ferocity. My stomach, already a cramped knot of hunger, let out a low, mocking growl. I had no money for the bus home, no money for a cup of tea to warm my bones, and certainly no money for the reality of life that would greet me when I returned to my silent apartment. I could almost hear Mr. Smith's voice already, stern, impatient, and devoid of the mercy I had just shown Anna. He would be at my door soon, his clipboard a ledger of my failures. Without the savings I had just given away, there would be no more extensions, no more whispered promises of next week. The mother story I had tried to build for myself was ending in a chapter of absolute scarcity. But as my own world narrowed into a struggle for the next hour, I allowed my mind to wander back into that hospital. I imagined Anna reaching the administration desk, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone to call Sarah one last time. I could see her opening that crimson backpack, her heart prepared for the crushing weight of not enough. I imagined the moment her fingers touched the money. Not just the money she thought she had lost, but the extra weight, the miracle I had slipped inside. I saw her face in my mind's eye, the way her breath would hitch as she counted the bills, finding that the gap had been closed. The price tag on breath for Arnold had been paid by a ghost who had nothing left to give. Inside those sterile walls, the process of saving a life was beginning. Nurses would be moving, machines would be humming, and a grandfather named Arnold would be prepped for a surgery that, only minutes ago, was an impossible dream. Sarah would be clutching her phone, her tears of despair turning into tears of confused, overwhelming gratitude. Meanwhile, I sat on a public bench 2 blocks away, shivering. My jar of dreams was empty, shattered on the altar of someone else's survival. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the sheer audacity of what I had done. I had traded my security for a stranger's relief. I had chosen to be the woman who was very kind, even if the cost was my own destruction. I thought of Neville. If he were here, he would have held my hand and told me that wealth is not measured by what is in our pockets, but by the lives we touch when we are invisible. But Neville wasn't here. There was only the gray sky, the looming threat of Mr. Smith, and the knowledge that tonight I would sleep in a room that was no longer mine. The sacrifice was a jagged pill to swallow. It hurt. It was maniac, a sharp cut to my own survival instincts. But as I watched a small bird struggle against the wind and finally find a branch to rest on, I felt a strange peace. I had emptied my jar, but for the first time in years, my heart didn't feel like a stone. It felt like a living thing, bruised and bleeding, but beating with a rhythm that mattered. Anna was beginning her miracle. I was beginning my winter. And somehow, in the cruel math of the reality of life, it felt like a fair trade. With trembling fingers and a bated breath, I leaned forward. The world around me seemed to freeze, the cacophony of the Pekalongon traffic muffling into a distant, underwater hum. There was only the sound of my own heart, a frantic drum against the cage of my ribs, and the ragged, sobbing breaths of the girl in front of me. As she continued her tearful conversation with Sarah, her voice a fragile bridge across an ocean of despair, I performed my sleight of grace. I slipped the enhanced bundle, the money she had lost, married now to the very last of my own survival, back into the gaping mouth of her crimson backpack. It was a silent gift from a stranger who knew the weight of loss. My hand brushed the fabric of her bag for a fleeting second, a star-patterned logo meeting the callous skin of my palm. In that touch, I felt the transfer of my own tomorrow. I was giving her Arnold's heartbeat, and in exchange, I was accepting the cold, biting hunger that was now my only certainty. I withdrew my hand with the guilt of a thief, but the peace of a martyr. I didn't wait for her to turn. I didn't want to see her eyes. I simply turned and vanished into the gray fog of the city, a shadow returning to the dark. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. Without the weight of those few bills in my pocket, my clothes felt thinner, the wind sharper. I was no longer a woman with a desperate tomorrow. I was a woman with no tomorrow at all. The reality of life was no longer a concept I observed. It was a predator that had finally caught up to me. As I reached the crumbling steps of my building, I saw him. Mr. Smith was standing by the door, his shadow long and jagged against the peeling paint. He held a clipboard, a cold ledger of debts that I could no longer pay. He didn't look like a man. He looked like an accountant for the grave, measuring my life in square feet of unpaid space. "Emma," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "I told you. Today is the final day. The grace period is over." I looked at his polished shoes, then at the empty hands I held at my sides. I had just given away my shelter to save a grandfather I had never met. I had given away my bread to feed a miracle I would never see. "I don't have it, Mr. Smith," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. It was hollow, the sound of a well that had finally run dry. "Then you know the consequence," he replied, his eyes devoid of the mother story, of mercy I had once hoped for. "The locks will be changed by sunset. I have a waiting list, Emma. The world doesn't stop for those who can't keep up." I nodded slowly. I wanted to tell him about Anna. I wanted to tell him about the crimson backpack and the price tag on breath I had helped pay. But men like Mr. Smith didn't believe in miracles. They believed in balances. I walked past him, my head bowed, feeling the weight of his judgment like a physical burden. Inside my apartment, the silence was absolute. I sat on the floor. The chair was already gone, sold weeks ago for a handful of rice. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the hospital. At that very moment, I imagined Anna standing at the billing desk. I saw her reach into her bag, her fingers searching for a tissue to wipe her eyes, only to find the heavy, impossible thickness of the bundle. I imagined the moment the air left her lungs as she pulled it out. The confusion, the disbelief, the frantic counting of bills that shouldn't be there. I saw her calling Sarah back, her voice no longer a fragile bridge but a triumphant shout. "Sarah, it's here. It's all here and more. I don't know how, but we have enough. We can save him." I leaned my head against the cold wall. Somewhere, a man named Arnold was being wheeled into a room filled with light. Somewhere, a girl named Anna was realizing that the world wasn't just a gray canvas of betrayal. I had no bed. I had no home. I had no Neville. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across my empty room, I felt a warmth that Mr. Smith could never evict. I had performed a sleight of hand that tricked the darkness itself. I was a ghost, yes, but for one brilliant, heart-wrenching moment, I had been an angel. The door clicked shut behind me as I left for the last time. The city of Pekalongon waited, indifferent and vast. I walked into the night, my pockets empty, but my heart echoing with the silent prayer of a miracle I had authored with my own destruction. I watched from a distance as she entered the hospital, her figure silhouetted against the harsh, fluorescent glare of the lobby. I remained outside, a ghost lingering in the biting wind of Pekalongon, my fingers curled into the empty pockets of my coat. Through the vast glass doors, the world inside looked clinical and unreachable, a stage where the reality of life was played out in hushed tones and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Anna walked with the heavy, dragging gait of someone approaching a gallows. She was met near the admission desk by a man whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature of the room, Mr. Smith. He was the embodiment of the cold ledger, a man who saw humans as decimal points and heartbeats as liabilities. He held a clipboard, a ledger of life and death, and as he spoke to her, his face remained a mask of professional indifference. He didn't see the girl who hadn't eaten. He saw a balance that hadn't been settled. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, my breath fogging the view. I saw Anna's lips move, likely repeating the heartbreaking news she had given Sarah on the phone, that she was short, that the cost of Arnold's surgery was a mountain she couldn't climb. Mr. Smith didn't flinch. He simply tapped his pen against the clipboard, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that I could almost hear through the glass. It was the sound of a clock ticking down for a man who was running out of time. Then, I saw the moment that will stay with me until my own last breath. Anna reached for her crimson backpack, her movements slow and defeated, as if she were reaching for a white flag to surrender. She unzipped the main compartment, likely intending to show him the meager stack she had painstakingly saved. I held my breath, the air in my lungs turning to ice. I saw the moment she opened her bag, her eyes widening as she counted the miracle she hadn't expected. Her hand didn't find a small envelope. It found the thick, enhanced bundle I had slipped inside. I watched her pull it out, a heavy, disorganized stack of pink and red bills that looked like a blooming flower in that sterile, gray room. The transformation in her was maniac, a sharp, beautiful cut to the soul. Her knees buckled for a second, and she had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. I watched her fingers fly over the notes, counting once, twice, 3 times. Her head whipped around, looking toward the doors, looking for a logic that didn't exist in a world ruled by Mr. Smith's ledger. But I was just a shadow in the dark, invisible to her joy. She looked at Mr. Smith, and for the first time, the cold ledger was forced to wait. She shoved the money toward him, her face a chaotic map of shock, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. I saw Mr. Smith's eyebrows rise, a rare glitch in his mechanical facade. He began to count, his pen finally stilled. The ledger was being balanced by a currency he didn't recognize, the currency of a stranger's sacrifice. Tears, hot and fast, began to track through the grime on my own face. In that lobby, Anna was no longer the Pelajar who had lost her way. She was the girl who had been found. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it, surely calling Sarah to tell her that the mother's story didn't have to end in a tragedy today. Arnold would have his surgery. The price tag on his breath had been paid in full. As I watched her, I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I had just witnessed a miracle, but the reality of life was waiting for me outside the hospital gates. I was the Juanita Bakehati, the kind woman the world would never know, the one who had traded her own roof for a stranger's grandfather. My own encounter with a Mr. Smith, my landlord, was still echoing in my mind. By tomorrow, my few belongings would be on the sidewalk, and the gray canvas of my days would have no walls to contain it. I had given away the oxygen I needed for my own survival. I was shivering, my stomach a void, and my future a dark, unwritten page. I looked at Anna one last time. She was laughing through her tears now, a sound I couldn't hear but could feel in the vibration of the glass.
She was saved.
Arnold was saved. I pulled my coat tighter, though it offered no warmth, and turned away from the light of the lobby. I walked back into the shadows of Pekalongan, my footsteps silent on the damp pavement. I had nothing left, no money, no home, no Neville. My pockets were filled with nothing but the cold wind of my own struggles. But as I walked, I realized that the cold ledger of the world had a flaw. It could count every cent, but it couldn't measure the weight of the moment I chose to be a bridge instead of a wall. I was a ghost, yes, but I was a ghost who had finally left a mark. I didn't need to be in the ledger to know that I had won. I had lost everything, yet as I looked up at the bruised purple sky, I felt a wealth that no Mr. Smith could ever take away. I was the invisible hand that turned the page, and for today that was enough. The sterile, white light of the hospital corridor felt like a surgeon's blade, sharp and unforgiving, peeling back the layers of my exhaustion. I stood in the shadow of a heavy fire door, a ghost in the corridor, watching the scene unfold through the small, rectangular window of room 402. Inside, the reality of life had taken a turn toward the luminous. She ran to Arnold's bedside, her face transformed from the mask of agony I had followed on the street to a portrait of frantic, disbelieving joy. I watched as Anna clutched her grandfather's frail, translucent hand. I could almost hear her telling Sarah, who was weeping softly into a handkerchief on the other side of the bed, that God must have sent an invisible hand to help them. She was showing her the bundle of bills, the pink and red notes that had once been a fortune in my own hands. She didn't know that the invisible hand was currently attached to a woman with a tattered coat and a heart that had finally, violently, broken open. I stayed in the hallway for as long as I dared, warmed by a fire I didn't have to feel to know it was burning. It was the fire of a secret grace, a warmth that started at the base of my spine and radiated outward, temporarily silencing the shivering in my limbs. For the first time since Neville's death, the gray canvas of my existence was pierced by a needle of pure light. I had been a shadow for so long, but in that moment, seeing Arnold's chest rise and fall beneath the thin hospital sheets, I felt substantial. I had traded my own survival for a stranger's breath. But the hospital was a place for the living and the dying, and I was neither. I was a Juanita Yang Sungut Bake, a very good woman, according to the video of my soul, but I was also a woman who is now utterly homeless. I turned away from the door, the soles of my shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. Every step away from room 402 felt like stepping back into a winter that would never end. I passed the nursing station, keeping my head down, avoiding the eyes of the staff. They were busy with charts and vital signs, oblivious to the fact that a miracle had just been smuggled past them in a student's backpack. I walked out through the revolving doors, back into the biting night air of Pekalongan. The city felt different now, vaster, colder, and entirely indifferent to the fact that I had just emptied my jar of dreams into the void. My mind drifted to Mr. Smith. By now, the locks on my apartment door would be changed. My small collection of books, the few pieces of Neville's clothing I had managed to keep, and the empty chair by the window, all of it was likely sitting on the sidewalk like discarded memories. I had no money for a taxi, no coins for a bus. My pockets were filled with nothing but the cold wind of my own struggles. I began to walk, my feet leading me toward the great mosque, hoping for a corner of a porch or a shadowed step where a ghost might rest. The hunger in my stomach had transitioned from a sharp pain to a dull, heavy ache, a familiar companion that whispered of my own mortality. I found a spot beneath the eaves of an old batik warehouse near the harbor. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and wet earth. I sat on the damp concrete, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to preserve the fading fire of the miracle I had witnessed. I thought of the mother story I had always wanted to tell, a story of a woman who lost everything but found herself in the middle of a betrayal of her own self-preservation. "Are you watching, Neville?" I whispered into the dark, my breath blooming in the air like a tiny, fragile cloud. I did it. I chose the grace. I chose the pattern. The silence of the night was my only answer, but it wasn't the crushing silence of the apartment. It was a silence filled with the rhythmic sound of the waves, a heartbeat that matched the one I had just saved in room 402. I closed my eyes, the concrete hard against my back, and listened to the whispers of the wind. They sounded like angels, not the golden, winged creatures of my childhood books, but the quiet, persistent voices of those who have known the weight of loss and chose to carry it for someone else. I didn't know where I would go when the sun rose. I didn't know how I would face a tomorrow that had no roof and no bread. But as I drifted into a fitful, shivering sleep, the image of Anna's face, luminous and transformed, stayed with me. I had performed a sleight of grace that had tricked even the darkness. I was a shadow in the night, a woman with nothing left to lose. But for one night, I was the reason a family could still say grandfather. I was the invisible hand, the secret whisperer, the woman who had traded her own life for a story that didn't end in a graveyard. As sleep finally claimed me, the calloused heart I had carried for so long felt light, as if it were finally ready to float away into the gray sky. I walked back into the cold evening air, my pockets truly empty now, yet my soul felt heavier than it ever had with gold. The dawn in Pekalongan arrived not with a roar, but with a gentle, bruised light that bled across the horizon, illuminating the gray canvas of my new reality. I had spent the night huddled beneath the eaves of the warehouse, my body a map of shivers, yet my mind was a sanctuary of warmth. I realized then that the greatest thing I ever owned was the moment I chose to give my everything to save a stranger's world. I was a woman with no roof, no bed, and no desperate tomorrow left to hoard. Mr. Smith had been efficient. As I walked past my old apartment building one last time, I saw a small pile of my life's wreckage on the curb, a few books, a tattered blanket, and the empty chair where Neville used to dream. I didn't stop to claim them. I couldn't carry them, and I no longer needed the weight of things that only whispered of what I had lost. I was moving light, a ghost finally untethered from the gravity of possession. I found myself drawn back to the hospital district, not by a need for recognition, but by a gravitational pull of the heart. I sat on a public bench across from the main entrance, watching the shift change. The air was crisp, smelling of jasmine and the distant, briny breath of the Java Sea. Then, the glass doors swung open. I saw them. Anna was walking beside an older woman who could only be Sarah. They weren't running this time. Their steps were slow, measured, and light. Anna's crimson backpack was still there, but her shoulders were no longer hunched under an invisible mountain. Her face, once a mask of agony, was now luminous. She looked like a girl who had been touched by a miracle and survived to tell the mother's story of it. Beside her, Sarah looked fragile but resilient, her eyes reflecting a peace that had been absent from her voice on the phone. They were talking quietly, their heads leaned toward each other. I knew, with a certainty that hummed in my bones, that Arnold was stable. The price tag on breath had been paid, and the ledger of the cold Smith had been balanced by a currency of grace. As they neared my bench, I instinctively pulled my collar up, trying to shrink into the shadows. I was the shadow that had followed them, the Juanita Yang Sungut Bake who had sacrificed her own survival for theirs. I didn't want them to see the hollowed-out version of the woman who had saved them. But Anna stopped. She looked at me, truly looked at me. To the rest of the world, I was just another homeless woman, a reality of life, statistic to be ignored. But Anna's eyes, sharpened by her own recent brush with despair, saw something else. She saw the shivering. She saw the tattered coat. She walked toward me, Sarah following with a curious but kind expression. I held my breath, my heart hammering a rhythm of terror and longing. "Excuse me," Anna said. Her voice was no longer fragile and trembling. It was clear and warm, like a bell ringing in the morning air. She reached into her pocket, not the one where the fortune had been, but a small side pocket, and pulled out a warm, wrapped piece of nasi bunkus. "You look like you've had a long night. Please take this." I looked at the small parcel. It was just rice and a bit of fish, but in my world of absolute scarcity, it was a king's ransom. My hands shook as I reached out to take it. As our fingers brushed, I felt a jolt of electricity, a connection between the one who gave everything and the one who received it. "Thank you," I whispered. It was the first time I had spoken since my encounter with Mr. Smith. My voice was a ghost of its former self, but it was real. "My grandfather's going to be okay," Anna said suddenly, her eyes shining with a secret she couldn't keep. "Someone, an angel we didn't see, gave us a miracle yesterday. I feel like I owe the world 1,000 kindnesses now." Sarah smiled at me, a soft, knowing smile. "We all have invisible hands watching over us, dear. Sometimes, we just have to be the hands for someone else." They stayed for only a moment longer before walking away toward the bus stop. I sat on the bench, clutching the warm food to my chest. I watched them go until the crimson backpack was just a tiny spark of red in the distance. I was still homeless. I was still alone. I still missed Neville with an ache that felt like a permanent bruise on my soul. But as I unwrapped the rice, the gray canvas of my days felt like it had been washed clean. I had given away my jar of dreams, but in return, I had received a wealth that was invisible to the ledgers of men. I realized that the reality of life wasn't just about the betrayal of poverty or the coldness of administrators. It was about the sleight of grace that keeps the world turning. I had chosen to be the bridge, and in doing so, I had found a home that Mr. Smith could never evict me from, the quiet, radiant knowledge that I had mattered. I took a bite of the rice, the warmth spreading through my body. I looked up at the sky, which was now a brilliant, hopeful blue. I wasn't just a shadow anymore. I was a part of the pattern, a thread in a beautiful, heartbreaking batik that Neville would have been proud of. The greatest thing I ever owned wasn't the money I found, or the apartment I lost, or even the future I had feared. It was this moment. It was the piece of a heart that had been emptied of greed and filled with the wealth of the invisible. I closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to the wind, knowing that somewhere in a hospital room, Arnold was taking a breath that I had helped pay for. And that was more than enough for a lifetime. True wealth is not found in the gold we hoard, but in the breath we help another soul to take. As Emma found peace in her sacrifice, we hope you found a piece of yourself in her journey. We invite you to share your thoughts. What does grace mean to you in a world of struggle? If this story moved you to tears or to hope, we would be humbled if you stayed with us. Your subscription to Mother's Story helps us continue telling the tales that truly matter.